Chapter 32 Troubled Pilgrimage. All public cars are on the grid, but Scythe can't track their movements until their navigational data is dropped into the backbrain. That happens every 60 minutes, so that's how often you'll have to change cars. Scythe Kirby's instructions had come as Citra quickly. She only hoped she could remember them all. She could do this. Her apprenticeship had taught her to be self-sufficient and resourceful. She ditched the first public car at its small town right on time. She was worried that there might not be as many vacant public cars in the Charlington region, especially this remote an area. But the Thunderhead was remarkable at projecting local need. In all things, there always seemed to be a supply to fit the demand. She had already changed into the coarse tonic frock and had pulled its hood over her head. It was remarkable how people avoided her. Vehicle changes every hour meant that her pursuers were always right behind her. She realized she had to cut a weaving course, like cargo ships in Mortal Age wartime, to throw them off her path and keep them from anticipating where she'd be next. For over a day, she could never sleep for more than an hour at a time. In several instances where there was only one road and no civilization for long stretches, she had to be crafty, ditching the car before arriving in town, where Charlington Scythes and officers of the local Blade Guard were already waiting for her. She actually walked right past one Scythe, certain she'd been caught, but she was smart enough to cross downwind of his DNA detector. The fact that the Scythes themselves were supervising the hunt and not just leaving it to the Blade Guard made Citra feel all the more terrified, yet oddly important too. Once you reach Buenos Aires, take a hypertrain north across Amazonia to the city of Caracas. As soon as you cross the border into Amazonia, you'll be safe. They won't lift a finger to help Xenocrates or to detain you. Citra knew the reason for this from her historical studies. Too many Scythes from other regions glean out of their jurisdiction while on vacation in Amazonia. There's no law against it, but it has made the Amazonian Scythedom uncooperative and overly obstructionist when it comes to assisting Scythes from any other region. The problem was the train in Buenos Aires. They'd be waiting for her in force at every train station and airport. She was saved by a group of Tonists heading to Isthmus. "We seek the great fork in the umbilical between north and south," they told her, thinking she was one of them. "There are rumors it is hidden in ancient engineering work. We believe it could be sealed within one of the gates of the Panama Canal." It took all her will not to laugh. "Will you join us, sister?" And so she did, just long enough to board the train north, right under the noses of more watchful eyes than she could count, holding her breath, not out of fear, but so she wouldn't trip any DNA detectors in the station. There were 7 Tonists in the group. Apparently this branch of the cult only traveled in groups of 7 or 12, as per musical mathematics. But they were willing to break that rule and add her to their number. Their accent suggested they weren't from American continents, but somewhere in Euroscandia. "Where have your journeys taken you?" one of them asked. A man who seemed like the leader. He smiled whenever he spoke, which made him all the more off-putting. "Here and there," she told him. "What is your quest?" "My quest?" "Don't all wandering pilgrims have quests?" "Yes," she said. "I seek an answer to the burning question. Is it A flat or G sharp?" And one of the others said, "Don't even get me started." There were no windows, for there was no scenery to see in the subsurface vacuum tube. Citra had traveled by air and on standard maglev trains, but the narrow, claustrophobic nature of the hypertrain made her uneasy. The Tonists, who must have been used to all sorts of travel, weren't bothered. They discussed legends, debating which were true and which were false, and which were somewhere in between. "We've been from the pyramids in Israel to the Great Wall of Pan-Asia, in search of clues to the Great Fork's whereabouts," their leader said. "It's the pilgrimage that matters. I doubt any of us would know what to do with it if we actually found it." Once the train reached a cruising speed of 800 miles per hour, Citra excused herself to use the restroom, where she splashed water in her face, trying not to let the exhaustion overtake her. She had forgotten to lock the door. Had she done that, her journey might have played out much differently. A man burst in on her. Her initial thought was just that he didn't know someone was in there, but before she could turn, before she could do much of anything, he had a gold-edged blade at her throat, positioned to do the most damage. "You have been selected for gleaning," he said, speaking in common, but with a pronounced accent that must have been Portuzonian, which was the primary language of Amazonia. His robe was a deep forest green, and she remembered reading somewhere that the Scythes of that region all wore the same green robe. "You're making a mistake," Citra said before he could slice open her neck. "Then tell me my mistake," he said, "but be quick about it." She tried to come up with something that would stay his hand other than the truth, but she realized there was nothing else. "I'm a Scythe's apprentice. If you tried to glean me, I would just be revived, and you would be disciplined for not checking your ring first to see if I had immunity." He smiled. "It is as I thought. You're the one they're all looking for." He took the blade away from her neck. "Listen to me carefully. There are Charlington Scythes aboard this train, disguised as regular passengers. You can't avoid them, but if you wish to remain out of their clutches, I suggest you come with me." Citra's instinct was to tell him no, and that she'd be fine on her own. But her judgment pulled rank on instinct, and she went with him. He led her to the next car where, even though the train was crowded, there was an empty seat beside him. He introduced himself as Scythe Posuelo of Amazonia. "What now?" Citra asked. "We wait." Citra pulled her hood over her head, and sure enough, a few minutes later, a man made his way forward from the very back car, dressed like any other traveler, but moving slowly and consulting an object in his palm that looked like a phone, but was not. "Don't flee," whispered Scythe Posuelo to Citra. "Give him no control of the situation." The device began to click like a Geiger counter as the man reached them, and he stopped, his quarry found. "Citra Terranova," he said. Citra calmly removed her hood. Her heart was pounding, but she didn't let it show. "Congratulations," she said. "You found me. Gold star for you." He was thrown off by the expression, but that didn't stop him. "I am taking you into custody." He pulled out a jolt baton. "Do not try to resist. It will only make it worse for you." Now Scythe Posuelo turned to him. "On whose authority do you do this?" "On the joint authority of Latrau, High Blade of Charlington Region, and the High Blade of Xenocrates of Mid-America, neither of which have any jurisdiction here." He chuckled. "Excuse me, but—" "No, excuse me," said Posuelo, with just the right level of indignation. "We crossed into Amazonia at least 5 minutes ago. If you attempt to press your advantage in any way, she has every right to defend herself with lethalish force, even against a scythe." Citra took that cue to pull out a hunting knife that she was concealing in her frock, and she stood to face him. "Make one move with that baton, and they'll have to reattach your hand." Behind him, a porter came into the train car to see what the commotion was. "Sir," said Citra, "this man is a Charlington Scythe, but isn't wearing his ring or robe. Is that against the law in Amazonia?" Never had Citra been so happy to have studied her Scythe history. The porter looked the man over, and his eyes narrowed to a suspicious glare. Suspicious enough for Citra to know where his allegiances lie. "Furthermore, all foreign scythes must register before crossing our border," he said, "even when sneaking in by tunnel." The Charlington Scythe's temper quickly began to boil. "Leave me to my business, or I will glean you where you stand." "No, you won't," said Scythe Posuelo, with such a matter-of-fact calm it made Citra grin. "I've granted him immunity. You can't glean him." "What?" Then the Amazonian Scythe reached his right hand up to the porter's face, who grabbed it and kissed his ring. "Thank you, Your Honor." "This man threatened violence against me," Citra told the porter. "I demand he put off the train at the next stop, along with any other disguised scythes he's traveling with." "That would be my pleasure," said the porter. "You can't do that," the scythe insisted. But a few minutes later, he found out otherwise. With her pursuers kicked off the train, Citra enjoyed a respite from the relentless cat-and-mouse game. Her cover blown, She pulled on street clothes that fit her from someone's luggage, jeans, and a flowery blouse that wasn't her style, but the clothes were adequate. The Tonists were disappointed, yet didn't seem all that surprised that she wasn't actually one of them. They left her with a pamphlet she promised she'd read, but suspected she wouldn't. Whatever your destination, Scythe Posuelo told her, you'll have to change trains at Amazonia's central station. I suggest you meander through several different outbound trains before boarding the one you're actually taking, so that the DNA detectors will send those chasing you every which way. Of course, the more she wanted the station, the more likely she'd be seen, but it was worth the risk to confound the DNA detectors and send her pursuers on a wild goose chase. I don't know why they're after you, Scythe Posuelo said, as the train pulled into the station. But if your issue's resolved and you do get your ring, you should come back to Amazonia. The rainforest stretches across the whole continent, as it did in the most ancient days, and we live in its canopy. You would find it marvelous. I thought you didn't like foreign scythes, she told him with a smirk. There is a difference between those we invite and those who intrude, he told her. Citra did her best to leave DNA traces on half a dozen trains before slipping onto the one bound for Caracas, on the North Amazonian coast. If there were agents out looking for her, she didn't spot them, but she wouldn't be so cavalier as to think that she was out of harm's way. From the city of Caracas, Scythe Curie had instructed her to follow the northern coastline east until coming to a town called Playa, Pintada. She would have avoided the public cars or any other mode of transportation that would pinpoint her location, but she found the closer she got, the more her resolve hardened. She would get there and complete this troubled pilgrimage, even if she had to walk the rest of the way. How does one face a murderer? Not a socially sanctioned killer, but an actual murderer, an individual who, without the blessing of society, or even its permission, permanently ends a human life. She knew that in the world at large, the thunder had prevented such things. Certainly people get pushed in front of trains, or under trucks, or off rooftops, in the heat of a frustrated moment. But that which is broken is always repaired. Amends are made. An ordained scythe, however, who lives outside of the thunderhead's jurisdiction, has no such protection. To be revived is not automatic. For a scythe, it must be requested. But who is there to advocate for a scythe felled by foul play? Which means that although scythes may be the most powerful humans on Earth, they are also the most vulnerable. Today, Citra vowed to be an advocate for the dead. She would deliver justice for her fallen mentor. Clearly the Thunderhead would not stand in her way. It had given her the murderer's name. So had Scythe Curie when she had sent her on this mission. The final phase of her training. Everything rested on the action she would take today. Playa Pintada, the painted beach. Today, the coastline was strewn with large trunks of twisted, gnarled driftwood. In the dwindling sunset, they seemed like arms and legs of a terrible creature, slowly heaving themselves out of the sand. Citra crouched behind a driftwood dragon, hiding within its shadow. A storm was moving in from the north, building over the sea and rolling inexorably toward the shore. Distant lightning could already be seen playing deep within its darkness, and thunder rolled its counterpoint to the crashing surf. She had only a handful of weapons she had started with: a pistol, a switchblade, the hunting knife. The rest had been too hard to conceal, and so she had cast them off before boarding the train in Buenos Aires. It was barely a day ago, yet it felt like a week. The home she watched was a single-story box of a dwelling, like many of the homes on the beach. Most of it was hidden behind palms and blooming birds of paradise. There was a back patio that overlooked the beach on the other side of a low hedge. Lights were on inside. A shadow periodically moved behind the curtains. Citra reviewed her options. Were she already a scythe, she would glean him, following Scythe Curie's methods. A blade through the heart. Quick and decisive. This was one instance where she didn't doubt her ability to do it, but she wasn't a scythe. Any lethal attack would merely render him deadish, and an ambudrone would arrive within minutes to take him to be revived. What she needed to do was incapacitate him, take him down but not out, and then extract a confession. Was he working for another Scythe or acting alone? Was he bribed like the witnesses? Was he motivated by a promise of immunity, or was it a personal vendetta against Faraday? Then, once she knew the truth, she could bring the man and the confession to the Scythe Posuelo, or anyone in the Amazonian Scythedom. That way, not even Xenocrates could squelch the truth. It would clear her of any wrongdoing, and the true culprit would receive whatever punishment awaits a Scythe killer. Perhaps Citra could stay here in Amazonia then, and never have to face that awful prospect of winter conclave. At the last traces of twilight, she heard a sliding glass door whoosh open, and she peered over the rough edge of the driftwood to see him come out onto the patio to look out at the approaching storm. He was perfectly silhouetted against the light inside, like a paper target at a shooting range. He couldn't have made it easier for her. She pulled out her pistol, at first leveled it right at his heart, force of habit from her training. Then she lowered it to his knee and fired. Her aim was perfect. He wailed and went down, and Citra raced across the sand, leaped the hedge, and grabbed him by the shirt with both hands as he writhed. "You're going to pay for what you've done," she snarled. Then she saw the man's face. Familiar. Too familiar. Her first instinct was to think that this was another layer of treachery. It wasn't until he spoke that she had to accept the truth. Citra? Scythe Faraday's face was a mask of pain and disbelief. Citra, oh God, what are you doing here? She let him go out of shock, and Scythe Faraday's head hit the concrete hard, knocking him out and making the horror of the moment all the worse. She wanted to call for help, but who would help her after what she'd done? She lifted his head again, cradling it gently as the blood from his shattered knee flowed between the patio stones, turning the sand in the cracks to red mortar, drying to brown. Journal entry. Immortality cannot temper the folly or frailty of youth. Innocence is doomed to die a senseless death at our own hands, a casualty of the mistakes we can never undo. So we lay to rest the wide-eyed wonder we once thrived upon, replacing it with scars of which we never speak, too knotted for any amount of technology to repair. With each gleaning I commit, with each life taken for the good of humanity, I mourn for the boy I once was, whose name I sometimes struggle to remember. And I long for a place beyond immortality, where I can, in some small measure, resurrect the wonder and be that boy again. From the Gleaning Journal of H.S. Faraday.